Hi everybody, my name is Lila Cherrih. I'm a lead practitioner and lead history teacher at Whitefield School. And for this year's Curriculum Thinking Week, I'm going to be presenting on Whitefield School's use of mini whiteboards to maximise student progress in history. So mini whiteboards are a really interesting one, I think, because in some ways they've come back into vogue, but obviously they've been around for a very long time. But the research is very unequivocal in terms of how impactful they can be when used effectively. So, for example, the EEF, who obviously as teachers we often refer back to when we're looking for research on kind of new pedagogical related things, they say that getting teachers to use real-time knowledge of their pupils' strengths and weaknesses to adapt their teaching can boost Year 11 students' progress by 2 additional months. And as I'll say later on in this video, this is very much something that we have seen at Whitefield in terms of our Year 11s, based in particular on our use of mini whiteboards as part of revision. Mini whiteboards also help give teachers a better and much more visible picture of whole class understanding and misconceptions. And obviously, as good practitioners, we then want to address those misconceptions in the moment, reteach any issues that have arisen, fill in any gaps, and mini whiteboards help us to do that in a very responsive way. Additionally, using mini whiteboards ensures that all students are thinking actively and independently. That's something that we've had a real drive towards at Whitefield this year. And going hand in hand with our no opt-out policy, it very much ensures a 100% ratio of participation in lessons. And if there are any kind of issues of students, you can then kind of address them there and then. Finally, it can also give us a really clear picture of the quality of our curriculum, where are our gaps, where is there need for more interleaving or the reteaching of skills or content. Because obviously we want all of our students to be thinking hard, and in an ideal world, we want all of our students to be thinking. And mini whiteboards very much hit that sweet spot in terms of ensuring both of those things, as indicated by the star on this diagram. And there's lots of really good research surrounding mini whiteboards, and I've linked a short reading list related to mini whiteboards in AFL as part of this session. Obviously, the teaching walkthroughs can be really good, especially for ECTs, PGC students, and they call them show me boards, and they have a nice little breakdown of the routines surrounding them. And I'll talk a little bit about routines later on because mini whiteboards are only as effective as what you're using them for and how you're using them. And I'll talk through kind of a few specific things that we do to make sure that they are used in the most impactful way possible. So how have we used mini whiteboards in history at Whitefield? So every lesson offers numerous opportunities to use mini whiteboards as an effective tool for assessing whole class learning. In 2022, I did a session with Curriculum Thinking Week on explicit vocabulary instruction, which is compulsory in all of our lessons across all subjects and all key stages. You can very much use mini whiteboards to assess the impact of your vocabulary instruction. So, for example, if you teach students a word, and we always do tier 2 words, so for example, to discourage, a word I used yesterday with my year 10s, you would teach them the word and then you might use your mini whiteboards to get students to write their example sentence. That allows you to see at a whole class level, have the class grasped truly what the meaning of that word is. If not, you can then obviously reteach it. You might adapt your definition. In the moment, you might give them another couple of examples, maybe a real world example of how you could use that word. So again, it's a really impactful way of very quickly understanding, have my whole class understood what this word is? I'll talk about this again in more detail later on, but we very much use it for mind mapping ideas, before a task, before an exam question. And probably the most transformative way that we've used mini whiteboards over the last 18 months has been in our low stakes knowledge quizzing, which is something that I'll focus on today. But like I said, I think it's about being creative, and I think we can use mini whiteboards at any part of our lesson, potentially, to maximize student understanding and progress by being able to maximize our understanding of those things. So, for example, every lesson at Whitefield begins with retrieval practice. And in history, we very much focus on helping our students not only retrieve content from last lesson, but previous lessons, previous topics, because interleaving is something that we very much built into both our curriculum and our teaching. You could use mini whiteboards to do some low stakes quizzing during your retrieval practice. That might be particularly useful before an assessment or a mock exam. You might also use mini whiteboards during retrieval to help them plan an exam question, so that application and recall of prior knowledge. I've already talked about retrieval. I've already talked about vocabulary instruction and how you might use it then. Another interesting way of using it to assess whether students have understood the word that you've taught them is by asking students to write on their mini whiteboards, what's a synonym of this word? So, for example, if I taught the word diverse to my year 9 students in our migration inquiry, to really understand if they've understood what I mean by diverse in a historical context, I might ask them to write a synonym of that word. And based on their synonyms, I'll be able to gauge, have they truly understood what the word diverse means? Another cornerstone of a Whitefield lesson is turn and talk. So every lesson will have a turn and talk activity, and we might use the mini whiteboards just to add some accountability to those conversations. So, for example, if I ask students to turn and talk to the person next to them and to analyse the source that I've got on the board, I might then ask both of them, make sure as you're doing that you're just jotting down the things that you've covered in your conversation on your mini whiteboards. That then allows me to assess whether that turn and talk has been purposeful, and then I might isolate a few things that people have written on their mini whiteboards and then use that as a prompt for further questioning or for discussion. There's a whole host of ways you could use mini whiteboards in the main task of a lesson in history. So we could use it for prediction, we could use it to do some low stakes quizzing and knowledge recall, especially if there's some prior knowledge that's going to be particularly useful for that lesson. For example, I just taught Nazi policies to do with women to my year 10s. And before that, I might just do some really quick mini whiteboard quizzing on what was life like for women under Weimar. Because to really understand the impact of change, you have to really know what came before. So it's a good opportunity to very quickly recall knowledge that is going to help make that new knowledge more sticky. Paragraph construction and exam question planning is something I'm going to talk about later. And then obviously you can use mini whiteboards for all sorts of different plenary tasks, whether that's summarising, whether that's quizzing to check that that knowledge has been accurately taught. Are there any misconceptions that you're going to need to address next lesson? And then the same thing in terms of if you've got exam questions as your plenary task or a paragraph as your plenary task. It's really, really useful in terms of planning, particularly for low prior attainers, SEN students and EAL students. So to begin with low stakes quizzing, because that's very much the most impactful way that we've used mini whiteboard quizzing. So last year we introduced mini whiteboard quizzing as part of our revision with both our year 11s and our year 13s. So every revision lesson and intervention lesson included a low stakes quiz using mini whiteboards. It was very much focused on specific detail because that was something that we had identified was holding some of our students back across the prior attainment spectrum. But we thought that's really like the big picture is there, but we really need to make sure that our students have that nitty-gritty detail that will allow them to really stand out to examiners. We also used it to support with essay planning and vocabulary recall as well. We've since expanded this to all of our key stages and very much broadened our use of mini whiteboards in lessons. I think mini whiteboards are only as effective as the habits and the routines that you instill in students. And we're really big in terms of drawing on metacognition and the science of learning. Routines need to be really, really clear. They need to be consistent. And in particular, the language that you use needs to be very precise and specific with students. And very repetitive, it's almost scripted, but it gives that familiarity that means that rather than students having to really understand what they need to be doing, they're focused on the task at hand. So, for example, my routine with mini whiteboard quizzing would be something like this. So I would say, without looking at the person next to you, I'm going to ask you to tell me what was the cost of a loaf of bread in Germany during hyperinflation. And I'll say, you now have 10 seconds to answer that question on your mini whiteboard without looking at the person next to you. And you might think that this is far too specific. You're never going to be able to remember something that's so niche. But I guarantee you, when we revisit this question tomorrow, you will better be able to recall what the cost was of a price of bread. Or what the cost was, of a loaf of bread. Everybody needs to write something on their board. So if you don't know it and you really can't hazard a guess, I want you to put a question mark so that I know that this is something that I need to come back to make sure that you've now learnt this for our next lesson. Okay, so start finishing your answer off. And now show me your answer in 3, 2, and 1. And then students will put their boards up And then I'll say something like, last lesson when we looked at the price of a loaf of bread in hyperinflation during hyperinflation in Germany, none of you were able to tell me that it was 201 billion marks. Now, let's see who's still got that fresh in their memory. And if you don't, it's okay. You're going to be much more likely to remember it tomorrow. And by the end, especially with the interleaving and the repetition of very, very specific questions, we were able to see that all of our students were able to recall really, really specific knowledge. And I think the biggest takeaway I would say is you really have to be ambitious with what you want your students to learn, but to really explain to them that repetition is how you learn specific detail. And to expand that approach and that understanding to much more than just really specific detail like the price of a loaf of bread during hyperinflation. And it's really empowering for our students. And in particular, our low prior retainers, our EAL students, they loved feeling empowered by the fact that they could recall something so specific that they weren't able to recall the previous lesson. And again, it's about making sure that the whole class is visibly thinking, and that you're then able to kind of give them that thinking time to really, think back to the depths of their knowledge, to that previous lesson, to 2 lessons ago, to 3 lessons ago, and to make sure that absolutely everybody is thinking deeply and thinking hard. So I would always have the same slide. So it would look something like this. I would put a photograph of the textbook that I was referring back to. You've got to build in thinking time. That's really, really key. So I always give 10 to 15 seconds when I'm doing a mini whiteboard quiz. And again, it's that no opt out. It's making them say, saying to them, if you aren't sure of this answer, please put a question mark so that I know that you're not sure of it, because that tells me what I need to reteach you. There are lots of ways, you can automate it. So with our year 11s this year, when we did Hardwick Hall, again, it was really specific. Who was the marble carver responsible for much of the marble work at Hardwick, and then kind of automating it. And the other thing that I would do is I would give them these questions so that they could do their own mini whiteboard quizzing. And lots of them invested in their own mini whiteboards. I used to always say to them, you can buy them in Tesco's next door. And they built it into their own independent revision, because obviously we want to teach them good revision habits, and that's kind of an aside to what we do in our lessons. Again, we've brought this down to year 7. So at the end of lessons in year 7, 8, 9 now, there's plenary tasks that focus on that really specific detail. Who's William's wife, for example. And again, it allows us to identify at the end of a lesson where are those gaps and things that we need to reteach. Another thing that I've used mini whiteboards for increasingly is to teach them what good planning looks like. Before my year 10s had their end of year mock, one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize with them was, if you want to get a grade 9 or to get to the top end of the mark scheme, you have to spend time planning your answers in the exam. So 20 minutes writing, 5 minutes planning. So before that mock exam, I spent some time planning what a great plan looked like on a mini whiteboard. So I would outline what does a good plan need to include, and I'm always, aiming to the top, right? I teach every single student what a grade 9 plan would look like, because then even if my low prior attainers try to achieve something very similar to that, that is going to be much better than me pitching it too low, and then they don't quite achieve that. And it's been really, really impactful. I would then model on either on a mini whiteboard directly or on my interactive whiteboard what I would want them to plan, and what that plan should look like, before then getting them to plan it independently. I would then give them another question, and I would automate it with a countdown timer, and then I would get them on their mini whiteboards to speed plan the 3 most likely 16 markers that would come up, in this case for conflict and tension. And again, really drilling home, got to have 3 paragraphs. I want you to star the most important factor, as much detail as you can write. And then if you want that grade 9, we have to have those arrows showing those links between our factors. And the really useful thing about this is it's low stakes. In particular, for low prior attainers, SEN students, even our middle prior attainers and our EAL students, sometimes they are fearful of committing things to paper. Whereas if they're planning on their mini whiteboards, they're much more confident in making mistakes because they know they can just wipe it off. The other thing that's really useful about this is, they'll have planned this essay on their mini whiteboards. I'll have put my countdown timer on. And when they show me their boards, I can very quickly see, I need to reteach to student A how to structure a 16 marker. I need to reteach to student B that their most important factor needs to go last. I need to reteach to student C, who's a HPA, they've forgotten that they need to have the arrows showing how their factors link together. So very quickly, I can see 30 boards in front of me, and at a glance, I'm able to identify what are the things that I need to reteach. And then I would do that with 2-3 different exam questions. So when they went into that mock, they had every single student in that class had planned the 3 most likely 16 markers, which then really pay dividends in terms of their performance in the mock itself. I've done something very similar with my A-level students, and again, I really drill into them. You know, you absolutely cannot get an A or an A star at A-level if you're not planning your answers. And again, I repeat to them, this is what your good plan needs to include if you're aiming for the A star. You've got to have your criteria, the order, the arrows. And so before their mock, we planned 2 20 markers, which allowed me to just identify some of the misconceptions that some students still had in terms of what a great A-level essay looks like. And again, those 3 questions. I mentioned earlier that we can also use mini whiteboards at certain parts of our lessons to help students recall relevant prior knowledge before teaching them new knowledge. That helps them build those kind of schematic links and make that knowledge much stickier. So, for example, in what ways are the lives of women affected by Nazi policies? I could help them recall relevant prior knowledge before writing that exam question. And the other thing that I would sometimes do with my mini whiteboards is I would do a deep dive on what a specific grade 9 paragraph would look like. So for this question, for example, I would combine exam technique and paragraph planning with low stakes quizzing. So I would ask them, so firstly, put your boards vertically. I want you to number all of the questions that I'm going to be asking you. So I just want you to jot down your answers. You don't need to write in full sentences. But by the end of my questioning, you're going to have what would be a grade 9 paragraph planned out on your mini whiteboard. Then I'm going to give you 5 minutes to write out your bullet points and your paragraph plan in your exercise books. So I would then ask them tiered questions in a very specific order so that they could order their sentences in their essay or in their exam question in a way that would help them to get a grade 9. So, for example, my first question might be, what was life like for women under the Weimar Republic? The second question might be, what beliefs did Nazis have about women's role in society? And I would tell them that needs to go under question number 2. So I'm helping them recall knowledge in the right order in order to have a coherent paragraph. Third question, they're going to start describing the economic policies that the Nazis introduced regarding women. And now I'm telling them be very specific. So, for example, what jobs were women no longer allowed to do or were discouraged from doing? Then I would ask them just to note down in one sentence, how would this have all impacted women? What are going to be the consequences of this? And then finally, were all women affected the same? Who lost their jobs first? And that is me asking them a specific question that I know they all know the answer to, but they wouldn't necessarily think to include in a paragraph. But in including that, they will then get to the top bound of the mark scheme because they're talking about difference. And the same thing with the last question. Did this change at all? What was the turning point? Obviously, I want them to recall that it was the Second World War, especially with 36 onwards as well. And that would allow every single student in that class, well, firstly, I can check where the gaps are before they write their paragraph. But in theory, they should have all planned a paragraph, regardless of prior attainment, that could get them full marks. So again, recalling prior knowledge, really, really speedy. So with my year 9s, we're looking at the 1960s. I just got them for 90 seconds, recall some of the key themes that we associated with the 60s last lesson. And I animate it so it's tiered. So first 30 seconds, who are the key people, who are key groups? Second one, what are the key trends, what are the key events? And then finally, what adjectives might be used to describe this period based on what we did last lesson? So I'm reactivating that knowledge that is going to help them understand, fashion and culture in the 1960s much more effectively. So impact, obviously, it's one thing saying these are all the things that we did, but obviously, we have to be able to measure the impact of the strategies that we use in the classroom. And in particular, last year, where we focused especially on low stakes quizzing, it was hugely impactful with our year 11s. So here I have some excerpts from some of the scripts that we recalled last year. And I think it's a real testament to how impactful that ambitious low stakes quizzing is. So, for example, we've got kind of we've got a low prioritizing student who also had SEN needs and EHCP, who's able to recall that Germany lost 13% of their land. That was a specific question that I had asked them repeatedly. What was the cost of a piece of bread? To recall back to my previous one, they said 201 million marks here. And this student, had, before we had implemented low stakes quizzing, been very much stuck at a U grade 1. And in the end, they got a grade 4. And I really think that would not have been possible without our use of mini whiteboard quizzing. One of the questions was on culture in Germany, and the same student was able to recall that one of the most popular films in this time period was Metropolis. That level of detail lifted the student's answers massively. Similar with another, EAL SEN student, were able to recall, 6 million unemployed in Germany. I really can't stress enough, you have to be ambitious with these questions. All students, through repetition, have the ability to recall really specific detail, and we have to give them the tools to be able to do that. Even with our EAL kind of middle prioritizing students, with our kind of general middle prioritizing students, they were again able to recall really specific detail. How many newspapers and magazines did people have access to in Weimar? What was one of the most popular books of the decade? All of those Treaty of Versailles statistics. Mini whiteboards really helps us embed that in our students' long-term memories. And again, our HPAs, also really rose to the occasion with it. Very similar in terms, what were the names of some of the new art styles under Weimar, avant-garde, cubism. How many scientists were there in Germany compared to Britain? This student wrote 350 scientists compared to Britain, who only had 30. Really, really aspirational in terms of the detail that our students were able to recall as a result of that low stakes quizzing that we did with them. So, kind of panning the lens back and thinking about the big picture, mini whiteboards have really transformed our approach to AFL. It isn't a gimmick. Obviously, they've been around for a long time. They don't replace other types of AFL. We obviously use it and to supplement everything else that we do, whether that's targeted questioning and obviously exam, marking. But it consistently allows us to identify misconceptions and gaps in our students' knowledge. In turn, we can then address them to maximize student progress in a very instantaneous way, which is what we want to be doing. We want to be able to understand what all of our students know and what they don't know, and how we can better reteach and fill in gaps. It's also really helped us to tackle what we call desktop truancy. So every student has to be engaged. Opting out isn't an option. And it has really, really helped our students be active participants in their learning. Just because somebody is quiet doesn't mean that they're learning. And combined with an ambitious approach to what our students have the capacity to learn, it's very much allowed us to stretch and challenge all of our students in every lesson. And obviously, it will look different in different schools and different subjects. But I would say, especially if you're doing low stakes quizzing, think about what questions can be answered in silence and have relatively short answers, what questions require prior knowledge, but also think about how you would order your questions. So you might want to start with some easier questions that build confidence, repeat questions when the majority of students didn't get the answer right. So even if in the same mini whiteboard quiz, I ask a question at number 2, and I recognise that 80% of students don't know it, I'll re-ask it at the end and fill in that gap. And then when I have my next lesson with them, I'll ask them again. And obviously you want to reteach kind of any errors and any misconceptions. I really hope you found that session useful. I've linked a short reading list of some articles, blogs, books that I found useful when I was researching what effective mini whiteboard implementation in AFL looks like. I've also included some example slides and templates that you might be able to use. And of course, if you've got any questions or suggestions, please don't hesitate to get in touch.